My great-great-grandparents, John and Jessie Shute, moved to 14 Victor Street around 1905, and at that time Heavitree was still considered a village. 1905 was about the time the electric trams were introduced, going from the city centre to Cross Park. That's where Butts Road meets 4 Street. I expect they were such a novelty then. John was actually a Heavitree boy and had lived at Oakfield Place, so I expect he was pleased to be returning home. Great-great-granddad Shute was a soldier, and I think my great-great-grandmother was left alone quite a lot. John and Jessie had 6 boys, and my great-grandmother Annie, their only girl in this 2-bedroomed house. Jessie must have struggled trying to keep 6 boys in order. Their eldest son, John Jr., was born in 1895, and he was probably expected to set a good example to the rest of the family and take over as head of the household when father was away, but that was not the case. John, aged 14, got into a bit of trouble with the law when he was caught stealing apples along with a younger boy named Henry Passmore from Mr. Howell of Wantford Street. The mothers were ordered to pay 5 shillings each as they refused to have them birched, but I'm not surprised. But John's behaviour must have gotten worse, as a while later he ended up at the Devon and Exeter Industrial School until he was 16. It was like a naughty boys' home. When he left, he joined the Devon and Dorset Regiment and saw action during World War I in Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. So, as well as Father John Sr. and her brother John Jr. being away fighting, Annie's younger brother Herbert also fought. Bert was a private in the Devonshire Regiment 4th Battalion and sadly died of his wounds at a place called Kut in Mesopotamia on the 3rd of February 1917. He was only 19 and is buried at Amara Cemetery in Iraq. Sadly, no one in our family has ever been able to visit his grave. After this, the Shute family moved away from the green fields of Heavitree to Paragon Place. This was in the west quarter part of the city and would most definitely have been a downgrade as they were moving back to the slums. Annie was only aged about 15. Her brothers were sent to the Rack Street Central School, which was always known as the Rack Street Naval College, and like most working class girls, Annie went into service at 6 Bystock Terrace.
Hi, I'm Mike. I used to live at number 4 Victor Street. My original name was Ackford, but I had it changed to Wilmot when I was adopted. I'll start with member 1963, when it was very snowy and icy, and getting a bit of hardboard and sliding down Victor Lane towards Heavitree Park, knowing there were railings at the bottom which would stop me going into the road. And I also remember, I don't know what year it was, but I'm sure it was during the 70s, Michael Fish, the weatherman, saying there was no storm coming, then taking the dogs for a walk next morning in the park, and about half the trees had blown over, and they were very big trees. Also remember riding my bike in the park and told by the park keeper to get off, but now you can ride bikes willy-nilly. Also, I remember playing in the back lane outside number 4 where I used to live, and told to go up my own end of the lane because they didn't like me making a noise outside their house. And that is about it. We came to live in Victor Street 1966, the 6th of June. It was a lovely quiet street. Everyone was social, friendly. There were about 3 to 4 cars at that time, so children could play on. I have made some good friends even to this day. We are still meeting to have coffee. I remember the winter of 1978. It started to snow on the Friday, didn't stop until Sunday. By then it was up to our front window sills. The men walked over to the dairies at Pinhoe, Whipton, to get milk. They came back with a crate. Then they all mucked in to clear a path so cars could get out. Then we all went sledging down the lane. The ground was enjoyable. Yes, Victor Street is something special.
You weren't allowed to walk on the grass. The gates was closed at a certain time. And the park keeper was always in his
It was a right so-and-so he was, the park keeper.
He was.
Yes.
Yeah, he was. The little toilets there. Remember the
I
toilets
can
and the
remember
drinking
the
fountain?
toilets. Oh yes, yes.
Yeah. I mean, didn't have the pools there like they got now. But yeah.
I can remember when it snowed really heavy. It's probably the one you mentioned in here, and there used to be a slope.
That's right. Yeah, you go down.
And I can remember walking along there in the snow.
Yeah.
And because I didn't know where the slope was, I just fell straight in the snow.
That's right.
Because I was taking the dogs for a walk, and the dogs couldn't see over the snow, so they were following my path through the snow.
You weren't allowed. No, you weren't allowed to.
You had
and dogs had to
respect
be
for
on.
everything, didn't you?
Yeah.
You know.
Dogs had to be on a lead.
Yeah.
Weren't allowed off.
Do you remember the drinking fountain?
Yeah, the drinking fountain.
You can get them now.
It was quite a nice looking little park there. As that the
Lovely
toilets
pavilion.
and wasn't it?
And a pavilion.
Yeah, and the pavilion.
What went on in the pavilion then?
A lot of hanky-panky there. Yes.
Not
Yeah.
a hanky-panky.
Did they? Oh, I meant did they have bands playing?
Yeah, more than likely. Although they didn't keep it up really. The roof went, didn't it?
Well, the vandals got hold of it, and they took all the tiles off the roof and thrown them about.
Didn't
So
they
therefore-
have tea room? Wasn't it like a tea room?
Yeah,
You used to have tea or
Was
something.
there really?
But
God,
once
quaint.
it started getting vandalised, the council just knocked it
Yeah.
all down. Got rid
Which
of
was
it.
a shame, really.
Yeah.
Because the tennis players used it as a
That's-
changing room, didn't
that's
they?
right,
then
they
up
did.
There, yeah, when they played tennis.
Yeah, they used to have competitions then. I can remember it
Yes.
well. Used to
Yeah.
watch the competitions of the tennis. I used to play tennis up the Heavitree Social.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And used
Well,
to go down there.
that was sporty up there, wasn't it?
Very posh.
Very
And
posh.
you used to go to the Wingfield Park quite a lot,
Yeah.
didn't you?
Yeah, we did.
Was
I
that
did anyway.
Was that
With
bowls?
Agnes and
Bowling?
Archie and Anne Allward.
I was a member up there since I was 16. Up the Heavitree Show
Wow.
Social
Really?
Club. I was a member before there was a bar. Don't know why I joined then, really.
Well,
But
I've
2
been-
years later, they
Yeah.
put a bar in. But,
Because
Yeah.
people could walk up there, couldn't they?
Yeah,
So why wouldn't you go there?
that's right.
yeah,
It was a nice club though, wasn't it?
yeah, it was a nice club. Yeah,
Yeah.
but-
Well, it still is really.
Yeah.
It's still a lot of people still go there.
It sounds like you had a great community on the street as well.
Oh, we
very.
did. Yeah, we did, didn't we?
And our children.
Yeah, children all played together. Still friends, they are really.
Are they? Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I even met Aggie's daughter today, the youngest one,
Oh, yeah.
Jane.
My house in the middle of my street is something I've always wanted to do and write about. And this project has allowed me to do just that. From 1914 to 2024, 3 generations of my family have lived in this house in Victor Street. When my grandparents originally moved into the house, it was rented from a landlady. In 1952, both my grandfather and my father passed away and the house was to be sold. This left my mum a widow with me, aged 6. With the help of the family, Mum managed to get a mortgage for £435 plus the £45 deposit, which was a lot of money in those days. Growing up on the street in the 1950s were happy times for me. We played marbles, skipping. There were no cars about then, and you could tie a rope right across the street, lamppost to lamppost. All the neighbours were aunties and uncles, regardless of who they were. All the doors were left unlocked. We were like one big family. If we needed to make an urgent phone call, like for a doctor, we would have to go to Mrs. Rice up the end of the street. Mr. Rice delivered veg from a van in the street Thursdays and Saturdays. He worked for Langdon's, the market gardeners. A baker's van also used to come too. In the 1960s and 70s, there were a lot of children living here. My daughter Karen played with most of them. They went to school together and, of course, knew all the mums too. In 1976, the year of the heat wave, our first bathroom was put into the house. My auntie would come across from East Swampford Hill to use the bath, and my husband used the old tin bath for years for mixing up his cement.
Number 34 and 49 Victor Street. William Henry Bolt of number 35 was the local coalman and was often pictured with his horse, Prince, on Victor Street during the 1930s. He was the grandfather of Janet Gooding. Janet's grandmother, Emma Chanter, did all the company accounts, which I think was quite unusual for a woman at that time. Janet's mother was Olive Channing, and she lived with her mum and dad and sisters Irene and Winnie at number 49 Victor Street. Olive met Derek Bolt at number 35 and they became childhood sweethearts. Derek's sister, her Aunt Muriel, remained living at number 35 after she married Percy Cridlin in 1941. Janet called them Aunt Mo and Uncle George. Despite moving away from Exeter when she was 12 years old, Janet often returned to Victor Street to stay with her aunt and uncle. She recalls happy times playing out with all the local children, including her cousins Brian and Patricia Cridlin. Of course, the street was a much quieter, safer place for children in those days.
At number 30 Victor Street in 1911 lived the Barnes family. Samuel, Harold and Elsie Daisy had 3 children plus 2 sets of twins. They all lived in a tiny 3-bed house. I'm going to read a poem that Harold sent to his wife Elsie before her death in 1947. To my dear Elsie, mother of the best in land, we lived together, worked together, we clubbed together, we brought up our children together, and we did our best together. God bless him, it will be done. From Dad Barnes.
The 1843 tithe map for Heavitree shows the field number 130 was a meadow owned by Henry Manning, Esquire. It was called witchet. A witchet is a type of lupin, and they were grown as a legume. The plant was brought here for the Mediterranean by the Romans. It is a coincidence that 4 Street, Heavitree and East Swanford Hill are part of the old Roman road into the city. In April 1896, the witchet was the property of Mary Ball Mitchell from East Swanford Hill. After her death in April that year, the meadow was being sold at auction. And at this time, the tenant was Henry George Stokes, who was a butcher of Heavitree for grazing his animals. Presumably, the lupins had gone as the flowers are poisonous if eaten. But sadly, in 1900, Henry took his own life. He left his wife Elizabeth, a widow, and to run the butcher's shop in 4th Street, and raised their 7 children on her own. The land was then bought by developers who called themselves the Witchet Building Company. The first houses on Victor Street began to be built in 1903.
Leslie Norman Brayley. Rosina and James Edward Brayley bought their first home at 39 Victor Street around 1921. They paid £250 for it. Rosina, known as Rose, was a Heavitree maid, and James, known as Edward, was from Exeter, where he worked as a male nurse at the psychiatric hospital. Their eldest son, Leslie Norman, was born at number 39 in 1921, followed by Thelma May, Douglas, Jean and Michael. Les recalled for the local press in 2018 that when he was a youngster they didn't have electricity in the house. In those early days there were gas lamps and an outside toilet. They had open fires to keep them warm, and they made toast which tasted wonderful. There was a gramophone for entertainment until they got a rediffusion radio. Les listened to programmes such as Dick Barton, a radio thriller of the late 1940s. He remembered putting a hot water bottle in the bed half an hour before he got in to help with the cold. Les left school in 1935, aged 14, and became an apprentice carpenter. He helped build the houses on Whiteway Drive in Heavitree. During World War II he joined the RAF, and later he became a nurse like his old father at the old Exminster Psychiatric Hospital, and that's where he met his future wife, Bridget Lynch. Bridget and Liz married in 1948, and they had 2 children, Sheila and Michael. After his father's early death in 1952, Les made the decision to buy the house from his family. He paid £1,250. At that time, everybody left their front door keys on a piece of string through the letterbox. You could buy a pack of 5 Woodbine cigarettes for 2p, and Les remembered that Ice Cream Man would come round on his bike, and you could buy a snow fruit ice lolly for a penny. In later years, Les still found time to do the waltz at Heavitree Social Club, play skittles at the Ship Inn, and attributed his good health to spending an hour a day on his allotment in Sweetbriar Lane. Since 1952 he had grown all his own fruit and veg, made jam, chutney and canned his own pickled onions and even made his own pastry. Lots of residents had allotments and they shared their bounty with the neighbours. Les even fished and he shared his catch too. Bridget died at Victor Street in 2002, aged 82, and when Les died in 2018, he had spent 97 good years living on the street. A Victor Street family, read on behalf of Susan Jackson, Lee Richards of 35 Victor Street. My grandfather, William Henry Bolt, had been a stoker in the Royal Navy until just before 1911 when he emigrated to Nova Scotia, Canada. When World War I broke out, he enlisted in the Canadian Navy, again as a stoker. He returned to Exeter to marry Emma Jane Chanter at St Leonard's Church, and the pair moved back to Canada. My mother, Karina Joan Bolt, was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1918, and by all accounts her mother Emma never settled in Canada. The three of them then returned to Exeter when my mum was just a year old. That's when my grandparents purchased number 35 Victor Street. My mother lived at 35 until her marriage in 1945. William and Emma went on to have a son, Derek Richard Bolt, born in 1921, and Muriel Eileen Bolt, born in 1922, and all three children attended the local Heavitree schools. After a long career shoveling coal on board ship, William started up his own coal delivery business with a cart led by his horse Prince. William purchased his coal from a Chanter relative who was an established coal merchant. My mum used to tell me that he had no head for bookkeeping, which he left to his wife. William either didn't know or couldn't remember the names of his customers and used to write things like Mrs. Green Curtains or The Painted Lady, who evidently overdid the makeup. That was in his delivery book, leaving Emma to work out who he meant. He was fond of his beer and generous to a fault when entering his favourite pub, after he had finished deliveries, and he would happily buy everyone a drink. My grandmother got wise to this and used to intercept him and relieve him of his money bag, otherwise she'd be left short of housekeeping money for the week ahead. William died in 1945 and Emma Jane followed him in 1946. I was born in December 1947, so sadly I never knew either of my maternal grandparents. My Aunt Muriel had already married in 1941 to Percy Reginald Cridlin, known as George, and they continued to live at 35 Victor Street, along with their children Brian and Pat, until George's death in 2004. Derek was married in 1941 to Olive Mary Channing. My mother Karina was still living at 35 Victor Street until she married Albert Henry Richards in 1945, and they went to live with Derek and Olive. In December 1948, they were given the tenancy of a prefab in Prescott Road, Red Hills, when I was just a year old. The Channings lived at number 49 Victor Street. Money was tight when I was a child, and I remember going on holiday to Victor Street to play with my cousin Pat, who was a bit younger than me. We used to visit Heavitree Pleasure Ground and buy sweets from Mr. Fitzroy's shop on East Swanford Hill.